So, colleagues, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome, everyone, and thank you, colleagues in Mexico and in New Zealand, for the very warm welcome at the start of this colloquium. It's my honour to be part of this. I'm Provost Chancellor of the College of Humanities, Social Sciences, and I haven't had the good fortune yet to meet you, Ambassador Perez, but I look forward to that very shortly, and also very good to see our New Zealand colleagues in Mexico. This is a very exciting colloquium, and I'm particularly interested in the topic, which is the one of encounters and also dialogue. So in my talk today, I've chosen research that will really allow us to investigate what happens in encounters and how we can understand them, but also what is the real meaning of dialogue. And I want to start off with that. So the idea of dialogue is the idea of everyone is in relationship with the world and with people and with events. So in this talk, I'm going to use, first of all, dialogical theory to look at what happens when there are particular moments of conflict or high stakes moments in our relationship with either someone else or with an environment. So I think it's a very topical, a very contemporary approach I'm taking here, because it looks at the challenges. The first study looks at challenges of coexistence in a globalized world. And the second topic looks at moments of conflict in online. So I want to, sorry, just getting this too. So I want to begin with this to give you a taste of what I'm going to talk about. Here's a story given by a teacher, a narrative account of what happened. The teacher is here in Palmerston North in New Zealand, and she is a teacher of refugees. And she is a highly experienced teacher, and she describes an incident. I'll just read this to you. The incident occurred when I was doing a unit on New Zealand culture. That week, we had got to the point of discussing the elderly. It took place between a man from Syria and me. It was the first time he had attended the class. This is what happened. I was explaining that parents moving in with their children was not a common occurrence in New Zealand. He told me he thought it was disgusting the way we treated our elderly, and really got stuck into me, giving me very little opportunity to say anything. I tried explaining that it was part of our value of independence, etc. And other members of the class also tried explaining that it is just a different way of thinking. But he clearly did not want to understand. It's the only time that discussing culture openly has backfired and caused conflict rather than preventing it. So this, I was invited in 2012 to work with teachers of immigrants and refugees in New Zealand who were finding incidents of conflict in their classes and finding this quite troubling. How were they to deal with this? And of course, this is just one moment in one classroom, but we see from this micro perspective, we can see conflict at wider levels as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to inquire into this and show the methodological and theoretical tools I've used to explore conflict, sudden conflict in encounters. So, by the way, this is a picture of Massey University, and I'm in the building on the right now. And So both of these studies come from New Zealand. So basically, as I say, I'm going to focus on encounters, and I'm going to also use the idea of life worlds. Life worlds is the notion of the perspectives individuals have about their own life and their own world. So they're two of the background ideas. The theoretical constructs I'm going to use are really looking at agency and a little bit about emotion, but identity as well. I'm going to look at two studies, the first one of conflict, the second one of online Spanish role plays. This was a study with colleagues Selena Bortolotto and Raquel Duranzo in New Zealand. So you can see New Zealanders learning Spanish online. And then I'm going to look at the conclusions. So the concept of agency is generally looked at from many theoretical approaches. And quite often it's looked at in geopolitical terms. So what's the agency of one nation or one group of the world in relation to another? Or it's looked at in institutional terms. What is the agency of someone in a particular role in the institution? Or it's looked at in social class terms. What are the agencies of people in who are highly disadvantaged, so in terms of inequality and poverty? But as I mentioned before here, I really want to look at dialogical approaches to agency and why they are important, because the socio-political and geopolitical approaches do not help us for what you might call agency on the ground. How do people act in one moment, and why do they act in that way? So in this talk, I'm going to, for the first study, I'm going to use dialogical theory. For the second study, I'm going to use sociocultural approaches. So you can see the difference. So in this first study, looking at agency and emotion within a dialogical approach, it focuses on the lived, felt experience of agency in relationship with others. So as I say, we are all in dialogical relationship with each other. And how people feel within that impacts enormously on their construction of people and place. So I haven't as yet been to Mexico City. I'm very much looking forward to going. Some people say, I loved it. Oh, I didn't like it. True for anywhere in the world. Actually, that is not a comment on the city. It's your lived, felt relationship in that moment. So the advantage of this approach is it means we are not homogenizing experience. We are zooming in to very particular encounters. So it's quite a fine-grained approach. This approach focuses on the emotions, values, and feelings that people bring to their encounters with others. And the reason I'm looking at emotion is we all work with emotion in interaction, and emotion can influence how people act, and how people act can influence their emotions. So we here are particularly interested in this teacher, Anna, in this moment of conflict. How did she act? And what was her relationship with herself, to the student, to the class, to her past, and to her imagined view of how she wanted the class to be? So, and we're going to do this via something called narrative accounts, and I'll explain that in a moment. So this, in New Zealand, we have, this photo is taken at Te Papa, our national museum, and in Wellington. And around New Zealand, we have people who work with immigrants and refugees funded by the New Zealand government. They have what are called social English classes, and the aim is to support people in coming settling in New Zealand society. And it was in this context that the moment of conflict occurred. So what I did, I was asked to investigate these questions of conflict, because although they were not common, when they occurred, teachers found them extremely troubling. And the conflict was sometimes between groups within the class. So, for example, there were students from Bhutan who came from very different political groups. So it can be that way. It can be conflict between families within one community, which happens in the class, or conflict with the teacher. And here I've looked at the conflict, one moment of conflict the teacher Anna found very troubling. So here, if you look at the second bullet point, I'm focusing on how their contingent approaches to working with matters of cultures and values in moments of conflict. So their contingent really means they hadn't prepared this. They hadn't expected it. It suddenly happened. So what do you do in the moment? So to investigate this, I did a 3-stage, 3 amounts of data. Oh, sorry, one other point. New Zealand is a bicultural nation, as you know, with Māori and the remainder of the population. And that agreement, it's called the Treaty of Waitangi, was for equal rights for Māori with the remainder of the population. Therefore, in these classes also, we need to make immigrants and refugees aware of Māori culture in New Zealand and that it has a very special place in the culture. And sometimes that too is a site of conflict, but I'm not focusing on that here. So to investigate this, I worked with a large number of teachers, and I asked them initially to write a narrative about a moment of conflict. The reason I gave them that opportunity was some of the teachers found these moments quite troubling and upsetting. So by giving them the opportunity to write, they could choose how they narrated the story. So they had time to reflect. Then I carried out individual interviews with them about the moment of conflict. And then we had a group discussion much later where teachers in general talked about how they worked with conflict in the classroom. What could they do? So one other thing, I'm using here an approach called narrative accounts. This is very important. It's quite a recent approach in the last decade or so. And here we are not interested in the truth of what happened. Did it really happen as Anna wrote it? So but we're more interested in how the individual gives an account of themselves in that moment. So we are not here doing an investigation of the event. And in this, we do not hear from the Syrian man. That's all we know. He, a Syrian man. But we all work in life with our own accounts of events. We share accounts of events with each other. So we're looking at this. Okay. So I mentioned this to you before. I showed this to you before as background to the event. So what we can see here is for the man from Syria, Anna is saying it was the first time he had attended the class. And that detail is very important because he was not used to the culture of the class. And the culture of the class is we listen and respect. We don't criticize each other's cultures. But if you notice here, Anna was explaining what was happening. And then he interrupted her and criticized one aspect of New Zealand culture. And this caused a big conflict. There is much more to the narrative. What happened, if we look at this in terms of agency, how Anna acted, agency, how we act is often based on our emotions. So this was very painful for Anna. If you notice, she said, I felt personally under attack. And each time I felt a little worse until by the end of the lesson, I was trying not to cry. Why was that bit there? Well, when we look inside Anna's narrative account, she says, perhaps my own past intensified my feelings. So in dialogical theory, we are also in relationship with ourselves. So here she is pointing out that as she looked inside, her relationship with herself was very difficult because both her parents had died before she was 21. So she did not have the opportunity to care for the parents, her own parents. She said it was hard being more or less accused of abusing my elderly parents when my parents had both died before I was 21. Of course, she did not say this in class, but when we look at moments of conflict in dialogical theory, everyone is also in relationship to themselves and their past. And that is brought to the encounter and was very difficult. She said, after the lesson was over, he came over to thank me for the lesson, but I was feeling so rotten, I could barely reply. He never came back. This phrase, he never came back, I think is very important here because as I interviewed Anna, she felt quite guilty that this conflict, she had not been able to resolve it in a way where he was willing and comfortable coming back to class. So this narrative account is full of her own concerns, her own feelings. You can see here her feelings and her concern also about the class. So, and I think her narrative ends with a feeling that she didn't resolve the issue. I then went on and looked at the interview. I interviewed her about her narrative, and she says here, I really just didn't know how to handle it. And interestingly, this was the reason I was asked to do the study, because teachers felt nothing in their life had prepared them for this type of conflict. So here she said she didn't know how to handle it because she didn't want to get into a kind of cultural war, arguing about his perceptions either. She was worried here. She says, I'm also with people that have similar patterns in their own culture. So maybe many people think the Western approach of not always having your parents come and live with you is problematic. She said they might feel I'm criticizing their cultures too, and that's not what we talk about. So here we think, if we look at Anna, she is concerned to maintain the culture of the classroom, which is one where you do not criticize others and you don't criticize their culture. And then she also, sorry, I'll just go back. And so here, if we look here, emotion and dilemmas of answerability, she feels answerable in her role as a teacher to maintain the rules of the class, that we do not criticize each other's cultures. And that's the point I'm making there. So she is working with her role as a teacher to try to model the rules which the class has agreed on. Then I said to her, do you think the situation was constructive? And she says, I don't think it was good for him. So she feels quite guilty about that because I didn't really handle it and he didn't come back. So she has a remaining feeling of discomfort and guilt with that. And yet I said to her, has it made you more reluctant to introduce certain topics? No, I'd do it again. I'd do the same thing again. So here we see that quite often what she is authoring herself as, while it wasn't good for him, she would do the same thing again. So she's actually saying there was nothing else I could do. So in the interview, I was able to explore more the interactions. And then I had a teacher group discussion, and I just want to make one small point from this. So that was all the teachers talking quite generally about conflict and how they handle it. And if you look here, they said at the end, I think it is difficult as a teacher. Someone else said, you feel a failure to some degree, don't you? And people said, yes, but it can be really demoralizing. But I felt the need to maintain my own to hide how I felt, actually for the sake of the class. They have enough to deal with. So in one of the conclusions as teachers discussed this together was that actually by hiding their emotions, they exerted some agency. By not showing how they felt more in control. They felt at least they had maintained their professional role as a teacher. And also, if you look here, the teachers had great empathy for the rest of the students in the class who were immigrants and refugees and struggling with settlement. She wanted to hide how she felt actually for the sake of the class. They have enough to deal with. She felt their lives outside the classroom were difficult enough, and that it was really important that she maintained a calm atmosphere, even though in terms of her own feelings, this was a very difficult encounter. So what are some of the conclusions from this first study, where I've just looked at one very small event and looked into the kind of emotional work individuals must do, in this case teachers, but in order to maintain the principles and values they have set for the class. And this is particularly important for New Zealand. So one of my conclusions is when we look at agency on the macro scale, it's a very limited view of agency and what influences people. Because when we look on the micro scale of everyday interaction, there's this messiness of the lived and felt relations between people. And it seems to me that this is one of the challenges of our age, the challenge of coexistence, that people learn to work productively with the messiness of lived and felt relations between people. The second point here is that agency and emotion were resources the teacher used to give some meaning to that event. So basically, she talked all the time about how she felt and how she acted. And in the narratives we give of ourselves and of events, we're often talking about, I did this because I felt that, I did this and because of that. But also we quite often look ahead and think, I don't want to act like that because that will have more difficult consequences later. So this was Bakhtin again, the Mikhail Bakhtin, the Russian theorist. He argued that in a dialogical approach to agency, we have this idea of creative answerability. That means we look ahead and we think, if I act like that, this is going to make subsequent events more difficult. So he, looking very much at the micro level, he described individuals as being on the threshold at each moment, deciding how should I act. And we don't just act in the moment. We're very often thinking ahead and thinking what might unfold if I act that way. So for Anna, she was very aware that if she did not keep her behavior according to how she had what she required of the class, which is we listen and we don't criticize, if she broke that principle, that could ruin the atmosphere of the class. The third point is an important one, the Syrian man. We know nothing about this man. We know nothing about his perspective. We know nothing about his life world, to use the word I used in the title, his perspective on life or his perspective on this event. This event occurred very early on in the conflict with Syria. So since that time, we've come to know more about the dense matters of conflict and disrupted lives in Syria. But again, I want to go back and point out our aim here is not to weigh up the teacher's account and the student's account and to find the truth. What would be the point of that? More, it's to look at the work individuals have to do in moments of conflict. So my final point from the first study is that when we look at conflict, we can also look at this idea of answerability. You're answerable to yourself, you're answerable to your role, you're answerable to what might unfold in the future. I'm sure our diplomats who are present often have to work with this idea of answerability in terms of what you say or don't say when. And so I think this micro study tells us something about the challenges of mutual understanding and coexistence in the 21st century. Since this time, I've drawn on these narrative accounts to work with teachers. So although they cannot prevent conflict, and it's often very difficult to work with it, at least they understand it is messy and difficult. So now, everyone, to go to my second study, which is, I should say, our second study. So this is with Selena Bortolotto and Raquel Dorenzo. And here we're looking at New Zealand learners of Spanish at Massey University, working online. And we're going to look at a role play, a Spanish role play, and we're going once more to zoom in to micro moments of interaction to see what was happening for those students. Now, I don't have the video of this. We don't have the ethics for that. But this study took, but I do have transcripts of the interaction. So here we have some learners of Spanish in New Zealand, and we have our lovely tutor there, Raquel, who gathered this data, and it was part of her master's thesis. So here we're looking at agency now, not from a dialogical perspective, but from a sociocultural perspective. And the sociocultural, remember the dialogical perspective, you're looking at your relationship, that's what it, to yourself, to the future, to the moment, and to other people. From a sociocultural perspective, we look very much on the context. So a sociocultural perspective looks at how do individuals act and the decisions they take, but the focus there is looking at the affordances of the environment. So in other words, individuals might enter the same environment, in this case an online role play, but they will use the affordances very differently, including the camera, for example. And also the affordances are not only the objects, it's not only the material environment, but individuals create affordances by how they speak with each other. And so you will see this. So here we're looking at the dynamic reciprocity between individuals and their environment, and also the significance they assign to events. So just going back here, what makes this study so interesting is when the students entered the Adobe Connect environment, it was empty. There was nothing, as it was for this colloquium. It was just a virtual space. But we put in objects, we speak, we acknowledge each other. Some of us struggle with the technology at the start, me, and so on and so on. But we are building the context. And so this is very much taking a sociocultural view of this. Oh, sorry, going the wrong way. Okay. So, and very much for the sociocultural perspective here, agency is about initiative, how individuals act. But the interesting thing is it's mediated by the sociocultural context. So you don't just act in life, you look at what's available and how you can use it. But there's also the responsibility aspect too. So in both of these theories of agency, there is this sense of responsibility. So how people act is they also draw on their own understanding of their responsibility in that moment. Okay, so going back this way. Okay, so this is quite a different research design. Here we're going to look at two focal participants, Catherine and Peter. But the design were the role play sessions for Spanish learners, and the data we use the archival data. So just as this is recording, online environments provide really interesting access to online archives. So you can go back and see how the environment unfolded moment by moment. Very interesting thing we can do. So there's in the past, I remember when people would set up a camera in a room and everybody was very embarrassed and felt uncomfortable, but it's very easy to get archival data. We use stimulated recall reports. That means we showed the role play to the participants and asked them to talk about what was going on, diaries, journals, and questionnaires. Stimulated recall has it's had a long tradition in education going back 70 years based on video recordings, but it allows us to take an EMAC perspective. In other words, it's a perspective on what the setting meant for participants at that moment. So each of us is participating in this colloquium, but for each of us, we all have different perspectives on what is happening. So by replaying part of the role play, we can stop the recording and say what was happening then. And for this, we selected episodes, they're key moments, and they were small but critical moments, often moments of tension or struggle. And then the next bit, which highlight agentive appraisals of the meaning and value attached to specific actions. So when people act, you cannot really know the meaning and value attached to that. We quite often try to infer that, but by going into the stimulated recall, we can see what was happening for the individual at that moment and what were they trying to achieve. So you'll get an idea of this in a moment. So Raquel Dorenzo set up 4 role plays online. This was the first one. It was at the time of the Soccer World Cup in Brazil. And the role play was, in each of these, was that the participants had to resolve something. They were each given a character to play, and they had to participate in the role play according to their character. And some of the characters for the World Cup were huge soccer supporters and thought the World Cup in Brazil was wonderful. Other people, excuse me, felt it was a waste of money, for example. Okay, so Raquel had pictures to stimulate their thinking about this. So here is the Spanish. You can read that. So the Spanish. So first of all, we're going to look at Peter, and this is the very start of the interaction. And I'll let you read that. So this is how the environment opened. And Peter was very interesting. His Spanish was very strong. But if you notice in the title for this talk, I talk about identity. And in the role play, people are really moving between 4 identities. They have their life identity, so their life experience, their perspective. Then they have their role play identity. Then they have the identity they develop in the class at that moment, and you'll see this. And then they have their learner identity, how they want to learn. So I'm going to show each of these 4. And I'm sure you've read the Spanish there. Now, sorry, I don't speak Spanish. I speak Thai and French and German and Te Reo Māori. So, but when I retire, I'm keeping learning languages, and Spanish is one. It's the next one on my list. Here we go. So Peter, this is a translation. If you look here, Peter was very concerned when he found he had the role play identity of someone who didn't care about the poor people and who felt, of course, we should spend all this money on this event. And he said, I'm happier with a more similar character. He means I would be happier if I had been given a role play character that was closer to my life identity. Do you see that? So this was very uncomfortable for him at the class at the start. And he says, my character is just the opposite of what I believe. So it was very important for him, for his identity in the class, that everybody understood, hey, I'm just playing the character. Do you see that? So he had to resolve that before he could start. And Raquel says, of course, I'm not interested in what Peter thinks at all. So she's joking. He said, these comments are from his stimulated recall. He said, I'm happier with a more similar character, but the group were very supportive. He felt comfortable in the group. And he said, I decided just to enjoy it. Humor always helps. And he ends, I'm a Brazilian citizen. Yes, so he's kind of resolved his life identity and his character identity and his class identity, how the class might see him. Do you see that? So he had to do all this identity work at the start of the role play. And he says at the end, I didn't enjoy going to Brazil and I still feel a bit uncomfortable. Okay, he enjoyed going to other Spanish-speaking countries. He didn't like Brazil. So he kind of felt he needed to sort this out before he could begin using the language. Here's an example of his learner identity. He made a small mistake. Raquel corrected him and he smiled as he remembered the rule. So he really loves his learner identity. And as a learner of Spanish, he's confident. He loves being corrected, right? But this is a very sensitive area with students because some don't. So the tutor said, Peter really enjoys the role play and cares about being accurate in Spanish. She knew that, so she could correct him without making a problem for his identity. But if we look here, when we say agency is mediated by the socio-cultural context, and I've mentioned that we can see how the socio-cultural context unfolds. Peter had a very important role in that role play. because as Ava, one of the other participants, said, when Peter says something, everybody could contribute and continue the conversation. So he played a very important class identity, that of opening up the conversation for other people. Yes? So he helped to keep the role play on the move. So we can see, just looking at this, that for Peter, generally, the role play was very positive. Now we're going to contrast that to one of the other people in the group, Catherine. So exactly the same environment. She has another character. And this is what she said in her journal. When I started today's session, I was very anxious, as I always am when I know I have to speak in Spanish. I'm okay if I've prepared very carefully, making sure that I have the vocabulary and know what I want to talk about. I didn't have time for that. So already the task is part of the sociocultural context. Already it's putting pressure on her. Because as we know, a role play, nobody can predict how it will unfold. So this was already a difficulty for her. So her construction, same physical environment for everyone, but in her life world, she found speaking made her very nervous, and also she needed to be able to fully prepare. So this was very difficult. So this is the beginning of her speaking. I'll give you a moment to read that. So in this, when you look at the recording, you can see her fiddling with her headset and moving right back from the camera like that. And that's because she's nervous. She says, you'll have to ask somebody else. I'm totally blocked. And Raquel smiles.
Cynthia, yes. We have, how many minutes do you think to finish?
I've got about 2 minutes before
Okay,
I finish.
Excellent.
Yes, almost finished. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Yes, so here, almost finished. So she says, I have to be careful or I start making up the words. So she starts making up words. And she said she felt she was sorry she couldn't do it justice. And if you watch the other people in the class, when she looks down, everybody kind of looks away because they feel embarrassed for her. So what we did, we managed to model these few seconds in terms of the emotion and the environment and what unfolded moment by moment. And you can see that for Peter's initial engagement was very different from Catherine's and the environment and what that impacted on going forward. And so basically, so that's the kind of the theoretical part. So basically, just to end, Catherine said the class environment was encouraging because the tutor is so friendly and positive. She's also very good at managing the group and their interactions on a medium which is actually quite difficult. So for Catherine, she found the role play very difficult. Other people didn't. So just 2 more slides. So when we use stimulated recall data, we can look very closely into what is happening for the individual moment by moment. So finally, what are the implications and conclusions? First of all, different theoretical approaches to agency, looking at how individuals are acting. We can widen the theoretical tool set so that when we look at encounters, we can look very closely, either from a dialogical perspective or a sociocultural perspective, looking more at the context, at what is happening for the individual, particularly in high stakes moments. So methodologically, I've shown you narrative accounts and stimulated recall and the use of archival data. They can also all help us to inquire into encounters. I've developed practical implications from both of these, and I think in the year of 2021 in the globalized world, where we see so many complexities and conflict around encounters, it's very important that we look in a very fine-grained way at interactions. So this is the Manawatu where I am. I'm finishing with some photos from New Zealand. These are the volcanoes just to the north of where we are. I don't know, Andrew, if this is making you homesick. So this is like Lord of the Rings. And then if we go down to the South Island, to Mitre Peak, it's also very beautiful. And finally, from me, thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to take questions.
Cynthia, thank you very much for your for this great conversation that you has given us. It is impressive. I don't know if you would like to take out your to see you take out your PowerPoint. But one of the things that for me, I am an economist, but recently we have friends that have been talking about emotions and economy, which for me it is very hard to understand. But with all these charts now, I understand agency and initiative as complete, meditated by sociocultural, and also a critical awareness. And then how you move agency, identity, emotion, or agency, language, and environment. And this is a great job that you have done, because especially with all these migrations that you are receiving, how you involve them in your cultural frame. And and this is very important, because if we see all what's going with the migration of sub-Saharan in Europe, it's part, and also that one of the problems that we have seen in France is that they haven't had a migration policy to include all these people that come from the migration on the second war. Between the first and the second war, they received a lot of migration, and then they continue, and the children, the grandchildren, and the grandchildren, they weren't incorporated in their culture. And I think the government has done a very great work in this cultural policies, but also related with economic policies, because to make and to afford all these cultural issues is because you have to put in your budget a lot of money to make this. It's not only that they come and these people arrives, and even you don't know if you treat them as animals, because you never respect their human rights. I think we will continue. I enjoy a lot your talk. It represents what is New Zealand, no? Which is when I was there, and I see how do they respect the Maori, how you begin a conversation talking in Maori. Well, I never thought that in Mexico we will begin talking in Nahuatl or in another language, as many as we have. Thank you very much, Cynthia. We are very pleased that you are here at UNAM, and we are also at Massey University. And I am going to give the microphone to Vanya. I don't know. I don't see Vanya, because to have the next session, we are just closing on time. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Cynthia White, our key speaker for this colloquium, as well as Professor Alicia Giron, the moderator of this session. So we will have a pause of a few minutes before starting the panel number 1. We already have our presenters online, Dr. Mark Bennington and Dr. Hugo Delgado. So we'll be back in 3 minutes.